Fora TV. The world is thinking.
Shine. In one hand, you can have a little accompaniment, you can have a melody, and the left hand, harmony. Crescendo, diminuendo, atmosphere. It cries, it weeps, it sings. This took 130 years to happen after its invention. And it is quite perfect. It will never be in any other form now than it is. So we have the intellectualization of the instrument. We have the idea of human hand, and the more sensitive you are in the body and in the feel, you look at the music, you interpret it, means nothing. Now you can make that forte yours, that piano yours, the way that phrase is yours, all within the composer's desires. Okay. So we've said that the instrument is quite perfect now, and that comes from 1709, 1708. And I will also say that the instrument's whole fulfillment is the whole reason that music developed. And of course, we cannot even conceive of a violin coming out and playing for hours alone. You're going to need the piano. The flute needs the piano. All instruments need the piano. It's a soloistic gem. I want to start with a very early example of writing for the piano, a Scarlatti sonata. It's not a sonata of Beethoven's. This is just a binary form. It was just a term used. A lot of people are confused. Scarlatti sonatas have nothing to do with the Germanic concept of the sonata form. He just meant exercise, actually. And this one is in repeated notes. Now, if this piano was in 1710, you couldn't have played this, even though it was not yet composed. You couldn't play it because it was too sluggish in the action. We'll talk about that a little later. It's all in repeated notes, starting on D, and it's very Spanish, as Scarlatti was Spanish, and he's born in that hallowed year 1685, when no less than Handel and Bach were born. Jung, are you ready to play the D minor Scarlatti sonata? No, she's not. Sorry. from 1500 to around 1750, the harpsichord was the great string instrument, the keyed instrument of the world, from John Bull in England in the Elizabethan time to Bach, Scarlatti, Handel, and Couperin in France. And that hit its apogee in 1740s, 50, at the end of 1740s. And the piano had been just an orphan. It had been created by a man that's quite unsung, Bartelomio Cristofori. Born in 1655, so that's 30 years before Bach. He dies in 1731. And it was in the air. Like all inventions, there was a desire very much to have an instrument of inflection. The harpsichord could only pluck. It's a plucking mechanism. The piano is a percussive instrument, and yet, strangely, a poetical one. It's a paradox. And Cristofori worked hard. Sometimes he's called Cristofori or Cristofori. He worked hard as the instrument curator for that great Florentine family. He was born around Florence, as Stratoverias was, and they were friends. Well, Stratoverias held the whole of Italy in thrall, while Cristofori was just a humble instrument keeper for the Medici family's instrument collection, and of course he worked on them and so forth. But in his spare time he had hungered. It was a hunger that was going on and never achieved in other countries. Could I make an instrument with a loud and soft? And he did it. Just around 300 years from now, and meaning right in the middle of, from the Renaissance, from 1400 with the birth of Masaccio, until this instrument 300 years later in 300. So it's right in the middle of modernity to our time. And indeed, it spells a tremendous aspect of modernity, because religious music was totally on the wane. Remember, the Catholic Church held tremendous sway, but by the 18th century, you know, the Reformation had now, there were so many splinter religions and pietist movements, and everyone didn't want this complex music of polyphony and counterpoint. And Bach was out. He was starting to go. His son said, you know, you're old-fashioned, Dad. You know, we like the pretty little tunes of the day. We like to sing hymns, and we want to have a domestic instrument at home and so forth that will, you know, accompany singers and so forth. Anyway, Cristofori understood this, as many people did, and when it came out, though, in Italy, nobody gave a damn, because it was the land of opera. They had started to understand and cultivate what singing can be. Singing was nothing quite unimportant until 1600, and it was so amazing. I'll give you a moment in history where in 1607, Monteverdi's Ariadne was performed, and one of the arias, with accompaniment and with violins in the little orchestra going, tremolos, and the audience started weeping. It's the first time in history, so symbolic as well, of what the new music would be once the church had not owned it, so to speak, and they really did. And now this new secular world was forming, and with it formed this music. So they were weeping, and through the whole century, opera became a madness for the Italians. They created the greatest singers that had ever lived, no doubt. Probably not one today had the virtuosity of these. By the way, when Scarlatti actually composed this sonata, Farinelli, the great castrato and the most famous performer of the age, was in Madrid, and he himself liked the newfangled little piano that was being made at that time. So we do know that Scarlatti, although the great harpsichordist, knew the new instrument and probably did think about it many times, because in his writing we feel that. But Farinelli accompanied himself for the king. The king had to hear him every night of his life. That was one of his duties, singing the same arias. By the way, the man was insane, as you know. And he liked it and so forth. So, but Spain was not in the big time. There was only, of course, Germany, Austria, and the burgeoning Industrial Revolution, which is England, of course. So the guy dies in 1731, and that's it. The violin is king, and opera is king, and we're waiting for what is going to happen. But in 1711, 1 year after, a very astute, and there were so many astute Florentines at that time, and they had many journals. He wrote an article about the future of this. He said, this is the future of music, the idea of making your own pressure make the sound and the emotion from it, and that it's not an instrument to accompany as others, but it is an instrument to be a soloist. Well, nothing happened. Cristofori dies in 1731. You know, nobody could fax or talk to anyone. It was a slower age, to say the least. And in 1725, so 1711 is the article, in Hamburg, perhaps, this fellow by the name of Silbermann, a 1683, 2 years younger than Bach, older than Bach, he used Bach all the time for his organs, but he was also hungering to produce a piano, an instrument, a keyboard instrument of inflection, and he had no idea. He had been stuck badly, and he did this in his spare time. It's so interesting, these connections. So what happened is that he's in the dentist's office. I'm just making that up. Because I say this only because when I'm in the dentist's office, you always see these magazines. So he sees, believe it or not, a magazine, a journal, with the translation of this article from 1711 by Scipione Maffei. He says, oh my God, this man, it's like coming out of heaven. This man has showed me the way. He had also, because remember, everyone drew very well. He also had drawn the actual mechanism of the piano. Its escapement, its whole, many, many inventions. And he went back to the workroom, worked secretly, and my God, one of the things he wanted to do was to say to his friend Bach, look at this new instrument. Bach comes in and says, I hate this instrument. I don't know how to play this instrument. Bach is of an old aesthetic system. He likes to weave, you know, he's not about now at the, you know, in his later years to start writing for this new instrument, which is really in the infancy, nor does it have a really good pedal mechanism yet. So he doesn't quite understand it, but worst is he does understand one thing. He doesn't know how to play with inflection. Look at what a baby would do. They just, you know, he doesn't know. It was as late as Mozart when Beethoven was asked, how did Mozart play? He played too much in a clipped style. He didn't have enough legato. It was the idea. Took a long time to make the human body and the ear and the coordination happen. So, when it did, of course, we have thousands of great pianists. Now, Bach says no. Silbermann doesn't talk to him for a long time. He is mad because he knows what this instrument is. Now, what happens to an instrument or any invention? There's been thousands of inventions, some of them unbelievable, but they don't have luck, they don't have the proper timing, they don't have the backing. Well, often the rich people of the world who are connoisseurs, or at least they used to be, would find out that something was good in the air. Wow, let's see. Well, there was a guy who is a connoisseur. He has only one goal in his life. How can I get Voltaire to my court? And you know who he is. He is the emperor, the warrior king of Prussia, Frederick the Great. Two mighty palaces. Now this is the beginning of the modern world without a doubt. I mean, our Herr Doctor system, I mean, if you want to look at our educational system and figure out what's wrong with it, go back to him. But it was all an advance at that time. But this real killer, this real warrior, was a fabulous musician who wrote over 500 flute concertos and would play every night of his life, and who is, again, a great connection, who is his court composer? None other than Bach's eldest son from his first marriage, C.P.E. Bach, of a new aesthetic system, of the gallant style and so forth, not of his own father's old-fashionedness. And he likes the piano, he writes an essay about it and so forth. And he is very happy working for the prince. And he says in 1746, because he knows Dad is very poor, and Dad is known not as a composer anymore, but as a great organist. Oh, I would like very much to meet the old Bach. I've never met him, said Frederick the Great. And Philip Emanuel writes him quickly. We have that letter. Get over, and to make it paraphrased, get the hell over here, Dad. I know you're almost blind, but you know what? You have a lot of kids to support, and the king may give you a very fine jeweled ring. This is exactly what happened. The old guy leaves Leipzig, he goes to the Sanssouci, the great palace in Potsdam, and the other palace in Berlin, and 14 pianos are now there. He likes them so much. Stocked here, there, wherever, because the king likes to practice wherever he wants to. And that's why I'd like to be a king. And so that's the story. He's happy. The dad says, yeah, I like him now. Gets back to Silbermann, he's so happy. A testimonial from Bach is very important. He likes him. Well, what are you going to say when you're with the emperor? You know, I have a new instrument. You know, you don't go and say to, when I say to Elliot says, that's a great new Steinway, and I play, I say, that's horrible. Bach was happy with him, you know, who cared? The idea, he got the jeweled ring, and that was it. And now we're going to stop at that moment, and we're going to bring Jung back. We're not going in any chronological order, but I want you to now hear her play. We'll get to Schumann a little later, but we're going to hear Schumann's Abegg variations. Abegg is a name of a girlfriend of Schumann who he told his mother was a countess. She was actually a barmaid in a tavern because he was 20 years old and he wanted to study music, and she said, you've got to be a lawyer. So he thought maybe that a countess would impress her. Well, the name of the tune is the letters of her name. And let me tell you, these are 4 variations in a finale where the new piano, the piano of inflection, is starting to shine. Bravo. That was an exquisite performance of the Opus 1. Schumann was 20 years old, and in a sense, you'll never really listen to the piano again in the same way, because the whole art of the piano is how the pianist plays the soft and the loud, how it moves in crescendo, in dynamics, and how sensitive is the artist in their soul, their being, their technical equipment to make it happen as the composer desires. So we have, by 1750, the piano is just hobbling along, and Frederick made his first great piano purchase, and Bach dies in 1750, and Philip Emanuel takes his half-brother, Johann Christian Bach, who was 15 years old at that time, and each of the kids had to take some of the other kids, and he took him, and Philip said, hey, you know, we have this newfangled piano. You know, Daddy liked the harpsichord and the little clavichord, which, by the way, is a wonderful instrument, but we cannot hear it, and it has no possibility of sound. But it was a favorite with the German world. And so the young kid, being a very new part of the gallant Rococo system, he says, I love this piano, and that is really your first pianist in history. So paradoxically, Bach hated it, and his son is the first pianist in history. And he then leaves for Italy, and we don't hear from him because at 21 they kicked him out of the palace. He had 6 years there, go make your living. And he went to Italy, you know, to write operas, but that wasn't successful. And we'll get back to him in a second. But the main thing is that by 1760, and this was because of the devastation. We have to remember that wars were going on at all times, constantly, unfortunately, and we've heard of the 7-Year War. It devastated Germany, and the 12 most important workers with Silbermann said, I've got to get out of here. There's no business. There's no economy. And they go, of course, to England. And they were called the 12 Apostles. And one of them, by the name of Johann Zumpe, created an even simpler mechanism than Silbermann, because he didn't have all of the necessary products. But they went crazy in England. There were ads, you can see them still published here and there. I want to sell my Stratoverias for a little Zumpe piano. Now that's a very stupid buy, but the point is, it was so new. The clavichord, the sweetness of the clavichord had never entered into the virginal, was so old-fashioned, and all the other spinets, and on and on. So this was something that England went mad for, and what's his name, Zumpe, became quite rich. And so here we are in the industrial bloom of England, and in the 1760s, those 12 disciples laid the foundation for all piano building to come. And it entered English musical life in 1767, during that decade that they were really doing their job. Very inauspiciously, a lady by the name of Miss Brickler was accompanied by a Mr. Dibdin. Try to imagine what they were wearing. And it was just a little aria in the intermission of the Beggar's Opera. And that was the first time in the history of the world that the piano, which is in the world psyche at this time, entered the musical life. Now comes back the London Bach, as he was called, Christian Bach, who had been the first pianist to really test his work at the palaces. He comes back, and on June 2nd, 1768, he's ensconced now. Italy was not good. He came to England. He was, of all the Bach kids were extremely ugly, except this guy. He was so handsome that Queen Charlotte fell in love with him, and you know, she had a rough time because she did have as her husband Mad King George III. Anyway, even Haydn said that Queen Charlotte, who's now studying with Christian Bach, was not a bad pianist. And he was the fashion. When Mozart came as 8 years old, for 8 months, Christian was mad about that child, and it was here, one more wonderful connection, that Mozart, of course, trained in the harpsichord in Austria, harpsichord land, was so happy to have this piano, and he gave up the harpsichord forever. Christian said, no more harpsichord, kid, get to the piano, and he did. Now, and indeed he did, because he stole for his sonata in B flat, the B flat sonata, that Christian Bach first played, and here it is, next June 2nd, remember it, in 1768, the first solo at an actual concert. All concerts were circuses. You had even a comb virtuoso, singers, harpists. But the first time in history, and Bach played probably from his Opus 5 Sonata in B flat, which then Mozart made even more wonderful in his sonata later. So France heard about, of course, this. France always being in competition, if not in war, with England, heard the Zumpas and just went crazy also. They didn't know how to make any piano. There was no industry at all, but they liked it. And when Voltaire heard it, he said, I am revolted. This newcomer will never dethrone the majestic harpsichord. The forte piano is an ironmonger's invention compared to the harpsichord. Now, in all due respect, it's the only time that I've ever read anything of Voltaire where he was wrong. For the piano within 10 years so supplanted the harpsichord that in the Paris Conservatory, the first institution for the public, a free institution for music learning of any society, in 1798, one of the strictures of the revolution was to give the arts its due. And Napoleon was also very much a part of that, although he was a Philistine as an artist. He would sit down and play the piano like this. Now sing, he said. But anyway, so that was the whole thing. And by the way, if you want to impress people, it still works. Because no one listens to what I say, but if I say Voltaire said it, everyone is interested. He still has that intellectual prestige. So next time you have something that nobody will listen to, say Voltaire said it. Now by the 80s, England is really doing very well. There's about, by 1800, there's 30 manufacture cellars in London. 7,000 squares, that was the piano of the day, 1,000 grands. They were much harder to make. But the grand came from the harpsichord, as you know, from the winged thing, so that was still part of the idea. And they extended the octaves in England to 5.5. There were only up to F. It was really quite small. Mozart never went beyond this, and Beethoven in his music keeps going and going and going because the pianos got bigger and bigger. So they also patented the new pedal, sustaining pedal, and as I said, there were 30 makers. Now, Broadwood and the piano business now begins. Broadwood sends a man by the name of Muzio Clementi. Some of you may have studied his etudes or sonatinas. Born in 1752, 4 years before Mozart, this is a very great man in the history of the piano. When you walk in Westminster Abbey, and I remember doing it, and I was so thrilled, I almost wept. I'm walking there, and I look down. The father of the pianoforte I am walking over, Muzio Clementi, is buried under there. 1752 Rome, 1832 London. One of the great entrepreneurs of the piano, one of the great pianists, one of the first great publishers. Remember, there's no publishing in the world. Bach's Well-Tempered Clavier never saw the light of day until 1802. So that was also new. It was an exciting time. So they sent Clementi out with the Broadwood on tour. He went as far as Russia. Then he got the idea, why should I be Broadwood? I'll do Clementi and Company. And by the way, you'll still see Clementi and Company all over the east coast of America in different museums or places, because that was the chic piano to buy after the American Revolution. Anyway, Clementi gets to Vienna with his Broadwood, and there's going to be a competition. And it's going to be with Mozart. And it's going to be in front of the glittering, and the most glittering court in the world in Vienna at that time, most multicultural of all countries. The emperor, Joseph II, the very gifted, he plays 5 instruments well, son of Maria Theresa, and there's a terrible competition. Mozart was very, very upset when he found out there was a draw. He writes to his sister, "Don't you dare play Clementi sonatas, they'll hurt your wrists." And in another letter he says he's just a mechanicus, and he says all Italians are charlatans. Mozart was not a good colleague. I remember once being in Horowitz's home, and we were going through Clementi sonatas, and I was telling him, you know, Mozart really trashed Clementi. Oh, what did he say? I said, he said, you know, all Italians are charlatans. And Horowitz looked, he said, Toscanini was Italian, he was no charlatan. And Wanda, his wife, was in the room. And Wanda, of course, is no charlatan. And so forth. So, in a sense, that was the end of Clementi. In 1803 now, the French knew what to do, and they had a great piano builder, one of the greats in history, Sebastian Erard, who was also a harp maker, and they were still around all through the 19th century. In 1803, though, again, this competitiveness with Broadwood and other firms, especially Andreas Stein, Mozart's favorite in Austria, they sent 33-year-old Beethoven, he's already very well known in Europe, a piano, and he was very happy with it. But now the most important improvement, the improvement that made it possible for that Scarlatti sonata, the double escapement mechanism, which now had the hammer only travel only half of its former distance. So the sluggishness was taken away. Oh, was that a hard one? It took a long time. Now, we have heard Jung play the Opus 1 of Schumann. We're going to hear her play 2 pieces of Chopin. Now, we talk about the pedal and we talk about the mind. Chopin is not only the poet of the piano for many reasons of emotion, but he's one of the greatest intellects to ever understand the design of the human hand and how, you could call it pedalization, would create an impressionist harmonic world. We're going to hear the exquisite Berceuse, a cradle song, Opus 57, and then followed by the Fantasie Impromptu, published after his death. Bravo. So by 1830, Chopin, Schumann, Mendelssohn, Liszt, and many others, they were unbelievably attuned to one thing, this instrument. And as Schiller perfectly said, the gods never come singly. So the maturity of the instrument and these great romantic composers come to write a tremendous literature in the 1830s and 40s for the instrument. Now, by 1831, there were the iron bars placed in there because now the instrument had to have an ability to stay in tune more, as there was a concert public that was going, and the thing was a jangle at times. It was a Boston fellow by the name of Alpheus Babcock that was the first to put a one-piece iron frame around a square around 1832, but not until, and notice America and the piano grow up together, so it's no mistake that the piano, which never had any harpsichord tradition, starts making some of the great piano manufacturers of the world. It was Jonas Chickering, you know that name. It still lives on, although the piano firm doesn't exist. Built the first cast iron frame for the concert grand, and it was able to sustain 30 tons of tension, making it stay in tune far longer. And then the pedal, of course. Remember that the pedal, in so many ways, is the piano. Chopin understood it so perfectly, Liszt beyond belief, Debussy even more. And it permits a kaleidoscope of changing harmonies merged by the pedal. Try to understand this. When you hear Mozart, you can't use much pedal. It's a primitive pianism, great music. But the pedal is depressed, that right hand pedal, the right, then the other strings which correspond to those depressed by the damper, the right pedal, vibrate in sympathy with the original strings, which then produces an aura, a soft area around the otherwise clear note. So by 1830, the Romantics could sigh and shiver and do everything they wanted. Liszt had his great duel with Thalberg, the first major European. He's forgotten now, but he was considered the greatest thing going, Liszt's rival. They had a big Paris contest. He was right through America, made a fortune here. Henri Hertz, there's a Hertz Hall. He was a piano maker. They all combined the business and the artist aspects. He was throughout America. Barnum wanted to manage him. He said, I don't even need you, boy. And then Chickering was the, think of this, I mean, remember there's a soundboard, there's the pins, there's the strings, there's 37,000 parts that make up the piano, very delicately. The, all of these things were actually creating an industry, the proper wood, and it became a very large American industry. The Chickering firm was the second largest building in America after the Capitol until it burned down in 1853. Now, they're, as I said, they're getting very competitive. We have 50, 60, 70 piano makers around the 1880s. And Henry Steinweg changed his name because in Germany there was a very fine piano that Clara Schumann loved called the Steinweg piano. So he called himself Steinway. And he's the beginning of what would be the House of Steinway, the greatest of all piano makers in history. So they brought in 1872, now try to think of a world, we're expanding. Emerson himself said, "'Tis wonderful to see how fast the piano gets into a log cabin on the prairie." This was their great, fusion of culture and entertainment. It was so important to them. Oscar Wilde, as late as 1887, coming to Central City, Colorado, and he couldn't believe. Of course, he was heavily drinking himself, and he was brawling on and on. He had a great time, but he wrote back to Lily Langtry saying, "I was so touched at the sign of culture," even though they had a new opera house, that it said, "Don't shoot the piano player. He is doing his best." I mean, those, mining towns were something. And the piano was important. Later on, the brothel was important to the piano. Scott Joplin would be called, as all brothel pianists were given that extra respect. "Professor Joplin, would you now play for us?" Things like that. And ragtime emerged out of that type of world. So Steinway, though, on the high-class level, brings Anton Rubinstein here, the great Russian lion. Liszt had retired. The greatest pianist of all time is now retired, and Rubinstein is going to come here. He says, "I don't want this American dollar, I want gold." It was a big mistake. They gave him the gold at the end, and he could hardly carry it all the way back to Russia. But anyway, he played. Now listen to this. Today we're wimps. We watch TV or we watch sports. This guy was bigger than any athlete in the world. 215 concerts in 239 cities, in 239 days, I mean, throughout. Think of it, in 8.5 months. Starting in Boston, through New York, Detroit, Cleveland, small towns, going on a stagecoach through Indian territory, finally got to Colorado, where he played his last recital, then came back. And what did he do with the music, with the money? He didn't buy a palace. He went to St. Petersburg because 10 years earlier, he had founded the St. Petersburg Conservatory, and it was already falling apart. And in the first class that graduated, it was no less than Tchaikovsky. And so he put all of that American money into rebuilding the St. Petersburg Conservatory. What else do I say? They then would bring Paderewski there. You would have in Europe the Börsendorfer firm opening as early as 1828, the year Schubert died. Then the Bechstein firm. Then in competition with Steinway, Chickering brought the God of Beethoven through von Bülow to America, where he played 200 concerts in an incredible span of time. All Beethoven's music, they couldn't believe it, from memory. And so, remember, no radio, no anything. There was a wonderful recitation that for at least 30 years after Rubinstein left was called How Ruby Played, and it was a backwoodsman who had happened to come to a Rubinstein concert, and he wrote a letter telling what this meant to him. He never heard a piano, never heard anything like it, and if you ever read it, you will die. I'm sorry we don't have time for it because it is delicious. So what do we have? We have these great pianists. We have piano teaching becoming a lucrative thing. By 1900, one piano teacher per 1,800 Americans. Think of it. And in the Depression, of course, it was famous. You could get a piano lesson for 25 cents, as my mother did, things like that. Now, what happens is that there's going to be a definite decline in the worship of the instrument. What is that decline? The decline starts right after 1911, the peak of piano performance, and noteworthy, the peak of immigration to the United States at that moment. But 310 piano makers produced 370,000 pianos. Now, to us that seems nothing, because got to remember this at all times, it's not a mass-produced instrument. I'm talking fast because I don't know exactly when do we have to end. 1:15? She said to 1:15. Yeah. Can you hold on? Okay. I want to just get this ending in because it's not tragic. It is for a while. So after that, by 1915, after the peak of piano production, what happened? Of course, the invention of the phonograph starts destroying it, and quickly. By 1915, there were, as I said, 370,000 pianos. By 1915, 500,000 phonographs were sold. So you see, the world's mass production is beginning. And it's not funny, because then the piano has to certainly contend with the radio in the 20s. Then it has to contend with well, the most important part of all, women's emancipation in a sense. They're not at home. They're not, I want to read you this. This is fantastic because it says all what a Victorian woman and what the piano, in a sense, meant to them. Quentin Bell described the plight of a Victorian woman. And he said that without a piano, she would have no way of relieving her libido by playing a Chopin nocturne. He said a lady was, in a refined way, so we've come a long way, but not very far still, a domestic animal. There are still too many domestic animal women. And it was her duty, Quentin Bell says, to devote herself to the home and to her relations, to be an obedient child, an unpaid companion, an amateur nurse, in effect, a kind of upper servant. Marriage was the grand aim of her youth. It enabled her to escape from the tyranny of her home and to exchange a lower for a higher form of servitude. It was a transaction to which she at least was expected to bring the gift of purity, a term of imprecise meaning but of immense importance to the Victorian middle classes. By the time of her marriage, if practicing the piano went smoothly, the young woman would have become accomplished. It was a great word at the time. At the keyboard, and this most valuable part of her domestic equipment would stand her in good stead with the many children she was now expected to bear. Now, we know that the piano is going downhill. The women are now out. They have shorter dresses. They smoke cigarettes. And they're working like hell. And they've never stopped. And the Depression hits. Of all of those 310 pianos, 29 companies survived, and it went down to about 60,000 sales. Then comes the Depression, nothing is going well. Then the war destroys the German industry, the American industry, the French and the English, and things aren't doing well. After the war, it perks up a little, and one of the great perks up is the great moment in history where all Western culture now impresses all other societies. As early, though, as 1897, Yamaha had produced 4 or 5 pianos. Yes, motorcycles would come later, but by war's end, he was doing 47 pianos. By 1980, he was producing more pianos than all combined, 400,000. Now it's up to 600,000. And so we may not have heroes like Liszt around, or Anton Rubinstein, but what we do have is an immense piano industry. Right this minute, China, and I couldn't believe it when I was there, the Yellow River piano factory alone, as far as the eye can see, these upright pianos are being made for domestic consumption, and they estimate that 35 million little Lang Langs are being produced for us now. I was there, I couldn't believe their desire to play the piano and how good they are. The problem is they're so materialist that they have no understanding of what Mozart had said. Stein, I love him, he's not interested in making profit. They are all interested in one thing, as I would give them master classes. Now, what do you want to be in life? I want to be famous like Lang Lang. And it goes to prove exactly what Bill Moyer said. The average American is today a mystic dreamer compared to the average Asian. How interesting. Anyway, we are now back to a huge production, more pianos being built in the world than ever before. Italy, which never had a piano industry, now has one of the great ones on a small scale. They cost over $150,000, they're grands, but they're the most beautiful instruments in the world physically. I don't mean in their veneer, I mean in the way they're made. It's called the Fazioli. And Jung has had a great privilege. You love it, don't you? There's only maybe 10 or 11 made a year by this very wealthy fellow Fazioli in Venice, and it's his life's work, and these pianos are among the most beautiful in the world. But Estonia now has a fine piano industry, Thailand has one, China has one. So all of the East is now producing pianists, and we will not certainly be a dinosaur as we thought for a while, especially after World War II. I do want to read this one little moment, though, because there is a reason for the decline of a totally non-mass produced instrument, and it is written by my own teacher, Arthur Lesser. And he said this: at the height of the reign of technology, he wrote this in '54, but it really hits home, only those things which machines can make the fastest and in the greatest quantities can command the fullest respect. Good machines must give way to better. Those that make things for 1 million are thrust aside for those that can produce for 100 million. While supplying of mere thousands becomes an act of charity, of eccentric devotion. The logic of the machine then colors all sense of values and all ethics of human relations. People acquire not what they want for themselves, but what machines can most conveniently and profitably make in the largest amount. A man no longer apes his betters. That was a great 18th century concept. Rather, he strives to be one of the great majority. One of those for whom the machines can do their best. At the climax of the worship of technology, its priests say Mass, using a word that pretends we are not men, but crumbs in a pile of the inanimate stuff that machines live on. And with you know that, we're going to hear one more fabulous piece, but I do hope that you get your iPods soon, or your iPhones. Liszt Hungarian Rhapsody number 2. Whoa! Whoa! You know, she plays it better than Bugs Bunny. And also, I want to say that we'll conclude with one little story, because afterwards people will always say, but how do you play the piano with such little hands? And there's a perfect story about that. Leopold Godowsky, one of the great pianists, by the way, they all came here after World War I. This became the great paradise of pianists as American culture bloomed. He was at a party, and some woman comes up to him, and Joseph Hoffman was also there, and they had very tiny hands, and they were both great virtuosi. She said, how can you and Mr. Hoffman play the piano on such a level with such small hands? Godowsky looked at her and said, Madam, whoever told you you play the piano with your hands? Loved it.